This presentation is designed to give you some tips on the do's and don'ts of PowerPoint. One thing that's good to do at the beginning of a presentation is to show some sort of an image or a shocking statistic that will get your audience's attention. So while I don't actually have a source saying that 99% of students are tired right now, that certainly would be an exciting statistic. A lot of people jump right into a presentation and they don't take the time to create an organizational slide. The organizational slide corresponds to the thesis of a paper. For example, what I'm going to talk about in this presentation is the importance of a thesis and outline, citing sources and photographs, and then some presenting tips. And finally, some common student questions and common mistakes. Let's talk about some of the ways that papers and presentations can be compared and overlap. First, we begin by thinking about audience and purpose. You might be creating a presentation for a general audience. However, you might be speaking to a more specialized scientific audience or academic audience. You may have the purpose to convince someone, or you may just be wanting to convey information. The choices that you make in terms of level of formality and the kinds of rhetorical techniques you might use will depend on who your audience and purpose is. But for whatever kind of presentation you're doing, you'll want to have a strong opener. As I did at the beginning of this presentation, some good techniques for that could be a surprising statistic or an impactful image. You can use appeals to your audience's emotion if that is appropriate for your audience, but this corresponds to a good hook in a paper. Also in a paper, you'll have a thesis statement. Now, you may not have a very specific thesis statement for a presentation, but especially if you're doing an argumentative presentation, you'll want to convey what your actual argument is in a succinct fashion. And then finally, emphasis. In a paper, your emphasis can be conveyed by how much time you spend on a particular thing or a particular kind of language. In a presentation, all of those techniques apply, but you also can use visual cues to be clear about what you're emphasizing. One way to create emphasis would be to pull a particular quote and feature it prominently on a single slide. As you think about your presentation, try to storyboard it. And by that, I mean think through visually what each slide is going to look like and how your information is going to flow. This corresponds well to creating an outline for a paper. One problem that students have is understanding how to cite correctly on a PowerPoint. Students have got several different options. For example, this option would introduce the author or source at the very beginning of the slide, including the page number that the information came from. And then I would include all of the information from that author and page in bullet points underneath. This works best if you have a particular author and source and all the information comes from a single place. Don't ever cite only verbally. So you can't just say, oh, this came from an article that I read, or this came from a particular article and a particular person. You want to go ahead and include that information on the slide itself so that you have cited accurately. If you are citing more than one author or source on a slide, I suggest citing at the end of each particular bullet point. So in this case, you have one source that's connected to the first bullet point and then a second source that's connected to the second bullet point. Now, one thing to note is that my examples previously are in MLA format, which includes the author's last name and the page number when available. However, you should also just convert what you know about the style of citation that is followed in your class. Some other common forms of citation might be APA or CSE, and you would follow what the citation looked like for in-text citation for whatever format you're using. And finally, another option for a single source slide would be to put the information about the author or source down in a corner, and then to include the specific page numbers for that information on the bullet points. So this gives you several different options for correct citation on a slide. The main principles to keep in mind are that you always want to include the author's name, the page number if it's available. If a source does not have an author, in MLA you want to substitute the title. In other forms of citation like APA, you might be citing the organization that created that information. So images can be a great enhancement to a PowerPoint. And again, there's not critical consensus about how images need to be cited. However, just like anything else, you're not going to want to just throw some images without any attempt towards citation. So one example would be to cite each image with a full MLA citation, the way that it would appear on a works cited page, directly below the images themselves. Some professors are not particularly picky about that, and they would just like to have the hyperlink where the information comes from. However, if you are citing a chart or an infographic or something that is taken from a source online, something that is not just used for clip art, always include the full citation. And here's another example of a way that you can slightly more cleanly create a citation. In this case, we only have the title of each one accompanying a label that is figure 1, 2, and 3. If you do create these labels, you will need to also create a figures cited page. Every presentation should include a work cited or works cited that gives the complete citation information for the sources that you have referenced on the slides. And if you are citing your figures by including these shortened titles, then you would want to include the labels and then the full citation information. But again, follow the instructions of your professor. Online tools can be great resources. EasyBib is a convenient way of creating citations, especially for images, as we saw previously. However, when you do use online tools, you also want to use your own common sense. So if pieces are missing or appear in obviously non-standard formatting, please go ahead and correct those on your own. So let's take a look at this slide and see what we think we notice about it. So we've got a lot of bells and whistles going on. We've got some non-standard fonts. We've got more than one font going on at the same time, and this is just sort of painful. We also notice there's no citation to that image. So let's talk about a great slide. Now, any slide that has Benedict Cumberbatch on it is probably going to be a great slide, but this one is also well designed. So you'll notice that I am using some of the features available to you in Google Slides and PowerPoint, including having particular bullet points appear on a click. So this gives me a chance to talk about each part of my presentation and then not give everything away as I am moving forward. So in this case, I would talk about investigation, and then I would talk about modernization. No matter what kind of presentation you're doing, make sure to speak clearly and slowly enough that people can understand what you're saying. Don't just read exactly what is on the slide. Another common question that students ask me is how much text is acceptable on a slide? One thing to think about in this situation are the conventions of your particular discipline. So for example, in the humanities, teachers might be tolerant of a few more words of text on a slide. In particular, if you are analyzing a particular statement, that would be a good thing to put on a slide, perhaps just by itself. Often you don't want to have complete sentences on a slide, but if you do have complete sentences, each bullet point should be consistent. So just remember to keep consistency in terms of whether you have a complete sentence or a shortened bullet point. Also, consider including handouts for complex charts or information. You always want your information to be visually accessible, and if you have something that is too small a font, your audience may not be able to see that. So this has been a virtual presentation on presentations. So do use online resources that are available to you, and don't hesitate to reach out to me or to the Writing Center if you need additional help with your presentations.